They say every town has one soul the wind refuses to carry away, the kind who lingers like a half-whispered warning. In Willow Ridge, that soul was a man they called the Scarred Cowboy. Folks said his name once, years back, but now it sat in the dust with 100 other things nobody cared to remember. He didn't look at you when he passed, and you sure didn't look at him, not if you wanted a peaceful day. But sometimes, ignoring a man is the cruelest thing you can do. If you believe no one should be left to disappear behind silence and scars, then settle in. And maybe like and subscribe, because there are some stories that deserve to be told before the prairie wind carries them away for good. I first saw him in the spring thaw, when the snowmelt was still running cold through the gullies, and the prairie smelled of wet earth. I was leaning against the porch rail outside Danner's Mercantile, waiting on the clerk to wrap a pound of coffee, when he came riding down Main Street. His horse was a broad-shouldered bay, steady under the weight of its rider, and the man in the saddle was, well, the kind of figure that makes you straighten without knowing why. Tall, shoulders squared, but with a heaviness about him, not the kind you measure in pounds, but the kind a man carries in his bones. His hat brim was pulled low, and the scarf around his neck rode high, covering the lower part of his face. But it was the rest of him that told the real story. The way he kept his head turned slightly, as though avoiding the sun, and the ripple of pale, puckered skin that crept from beneath the hat's shadow down the side of his jaw. No one called out a greeting. No one waved. The conversations on the boardwalk thinned and died, like someone had pulled the air out of them. Even old Billings, who never could resist jawing at a stranger, just stared at the ground and thumbed his suspenders. The cowboy dismounted slow, his boots hitting the dirt with the solid finality of a man who doesn't hurry for anyone, and tied his horse to the post outside the feed store. He didn't speak a word as he went inside. I'd heard the whispers, the fire, the night screams, the fact that he hadn't been seen in church since the year of the big blizzard. Some said he'd been a rancher once, out near the East Ridge. Others said he'd drifted in from somewhere farther than most folks could point to on a map. Whatever the truth, he belonged to that quiet breed of men who never offer their story and sure as hell don't answer when asked. But there was something in the way he moved, deliberate, like every step had been measured and weighed before it left the ground. That told me he hadn't always been invisible. There's a kind of dignity in a man who's had something taken from him and still walks like he owns his shadow. He came out of the feed store a few minutes later with a sack of grain slung over one shoulder and a small wrapped parcel under his arm. That was when a wind gust caught the scarf at his neck, tugging it just enough for the late morning light to hit the scars beneath. I've seen burn scars before, but his were the kind that told a longer story, not the random pattern of accident, but a map etched by flame and survival. One side of his face was a raw topography of ridges and valleys, pale against the weather-browned skin of the other. His left eye, sharp and bright, swept the street once, then fixed on something or someone I couldn't see. And here's the thing. The street was quiet, but not empty. Women were carrying baskets from the mercantile. A boy chased a hoop down past the livery. 2 ranch hands were talking near the well. But every single one of them stepped just a little farther away from his path, without looking like they meant to. That's when I knew the truth. In Willow Ridge, this man wasn't dangerous because of what he'd done. He was dangerous because of what people refused to know. It happened 3 weeks later. On a day so cold the breath from every horse and human in town looked like steam rising off a boiling pot. I'd gone into Danner's early, hoping to beat the snow that was threatening to roll in over the ridge, but the place was busier than usual. A cattle drive had brought in a handful of drovers, and the air inside was thick with their laughter and the smell of wet leather. I was halfway through haggling with the clerk over the price of flour when the door opened, and that same heavy quiet from before rolled in ahead of him like a shadow crossing the sun. The Scarred Cowboy. Same bay horse outside. Same low hat brim. Same scarf tucked high around his jaw. I told myself not to look at him, but I've never been good at doing what's expected. He moved slow along the back shelves, picking up only what he needed. Nails, lamp oil, a box of cartridges. It struck me then that he bought things the way a man lives when he's used to leaving at a moment's notice. Small, packable, nothing that roots you too deep in one place. It all would have passed like any other sighting, me pretending not to watch him, him pretending not to see me, if not for the crate of apples. Some young hand from the ranch up north came barreling in behind him, shoulders hunched against the wind, and smacked square into the display by the counter. The crate tipped, apples spilling like marbles across the floor. The boy cursed under his breath and bent to gather them up, but the thing about apples is they'll roll under anything with a gap big enough to take them. One of them bumped against my boot, and I bent down at the same time someone else did. His hand was there before mine. I don't know what I expected. Maybe the rough, unyielding grip of a man carved by hardship. But his hand was warm. Calloused, yes, but steady, and trembling just enough that I felt it through the thin skin of my fingers. When I looked up, the brim of his hat hid most of his expression, but his visible eye, that sharp, burnished iron eye, was locked on mine. For the space of a heartbeat, no one else in that store existed. And here's the thing that'll stick with me until the day I die. It wasn't pity I felt in that moment, and it wasn't fear. It was recognition, the kind that happens when two people spot the same kind of lonely in each other. I should have dropped the apple in his hand and moved on. That's what polite folks do in Willow Ridge when the scarred cowboy's around. But instead, I said, quiet enough that no one else could hear, "You all right?" The tremor in his hand stilled. His eye narrowed, not in anger, but in the way a man does when he's trying to decide if you're making sport of him. And then, in a voice low and rough from disuse, he said, "I get by." The boy mumbled an apology for the mess. The clerk started fussing over the scattered fruit, and just like that, the moment should have ended. But I didn't let go. My fingers stayed wrapped around his for half a second longer than necessary, and I felt that hesitation travel through him like a pulse. That was when I knew. If I wanted to understand the story behind those scars, it wouldn't come from town gossip or sideways glances. I'd have to hear it from his own mouth. And a man like him, he wouldn't tell it to anyone who hadn't already shown they were willing to stand in the same quiet he lived in every day. It was the next evening when I found him again, though found makes it sound like I was looking, and maybe I was. The wind had come up out of the north, carrying with it the smell of snow, and the street lanterns flickered like they were thinking about giving up for the night. I'd stopped at the diner to carry home a pot of stew for supper, and there he was, sitting alone at the far end of the counter, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. He glanced up when the bell over the door rang, but didn't look away fast enough for me to miss the flicker of recognition. I took the seat beside him without asking, not because I was brave, but because sometimes you've got to step into the silence if you want to change it. For a while, we just sat there. The place was nearly empty. The only sounds the hiss of the coffee urn and the low murmur of the radio behind the counter. Then, like he was letting a dam break on his own terms, he said, "Colt Avery." It took me a second to understand. "Your name?" He nodded. "Figured if you were going to sit there waiting on it, might as well give it to you straight." His voice was still gravel over stone, but it carried a weight I hadn't heard the day before. I told him mine, and then I waited. I've learned the trick with people who guard their stories is not to rush them. If they sense you're only after the parts that shine, they'll clam up tighter than a bank vault. He stared into his coffee for a long moment before speaking again. 3 winters ago, there was a fire. My wife, my little girl. He swallowed hard, like the words themselves were ash in his mouth. I got him out, but not in time. Smoke, fire, they didn't make it. I stayed too long. That's how. He lifted a hand to the side of his face, not quite touching the scars, just acknowledging them. Doctors called me lucky. I didn't feel lucky. The silence after that was heavier than the one before, thick with the smell of burnt timber only he could still taste. He told me about the drunk who'd knocked over a lamp, the way the house went up faster than kindling, the moment he realized the 2 people he loved most in the world weren't breathing anymore, how he'd buried them on a hill that looked west toward the mountains, and how after that, the ranch he'd built for them felt like nothing but empty boards and wind. "I left," he said simply. "Started drifting, fixing fences, breaking horses. Didn't talk much. Didn't need to. Folks don't want to know the man with the ruined face." He took a slow sip of coffee. Easier that way. For them. For me. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe the way his voice had gone quiet at the end. Maybe the fact that his shoulders looked like they'd been carrying the whole sky for years. But I reached over and laid my hand on top of his. No hesitation this time. His hand twitched, just once, like he wasn't sure if he should pull away. But then it settled under mine, warm and steady. "Colt," I said, letting his name sit there between us. "The way I see it, scars just mean the story's still being written. And I'd like to know how the rest of yours goes." For the first time since I'd seen him, he smiled. Not much, just a small, tired curve at the corner of his mouth. But it was enough to tell me I'd just stepped into the part of his life where the silence ended.